Introduction. A legend passed through time. There are countless figures in European history whose names are linked to great events, to battles that shifted kingdoms, to voyages that opened oceans, and to reforms that shaped nations. Yet, curiously, some of these same names are remembered not for their grandest achievements, but for strange little stories that cling to them like cobwebs in an old hall. One such figure is Isabella of Castile, remembered as Isabella the Catholic, one of the most powerful queens of late medieval Europe. She was a queen who united kingdoms, who financed voyages that carried ships across the Atlantic, who stood at the very center of 15th century politics. And yet, a curious legend insists that during one of her wars, Isabella made a vow not to change her undergarments until victory was achieved. According to the whisper of this myth, she kept that vow for so long that her neglect of clothing and cleanliness brought Spain itself to the brink of plague. Now, let us take our time with this story. Let us wander slowly, with no urgency, through the world of Isabella's Spain. Let us look at the war in Granada, the way people thought about hygiene, and the strange way legends are born. And as we walk through these quiet corridors of the past, you may notice your own mind slowing too, resting gently as the story unfolds in calm detail. Chapter 1. Spain in the 15th century. To understand Isabella's place in this story, one must first imagine Spain in the 15th century. It was not yet the Spain we know on modern maps, a unified country stretching from the Bay of Biscay to the southern shores of Andalusia. Instead, it was a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own rulers, customs, and ambitions. Castile, the largest and richest of the realms, stretched across the northern and central plains. Its lands were wide and fertile, producing wheat and sheep wool that supported great towns like Toledo and Burgos. To the east lay the crown of Aragon, with its bustling Mediterranean ports, Barcelona, Valencia, Zaragoza, cities that looked outward across the sea, trading with Italy and beyond. To the west sat Portugal, separate and self-confident, with its own eyes fixed firmly on the Atlantic. And in the south, on the very edge of the Christian kingdoms, remained Granada, the last Muslim emirate in Iberia, a glittering stronghold that had endured for centuries against crusades and campaigns. It was into this divided world that Isabella rose to power. She married Ferdinand of Aragon, a union that tied Castile and Aragon together, forming a partnership that would reshape Spain. But to fully cement their rule, they needed to complete what generations before them had called the Reconquista, the long, slow reclaiming of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslim rule. And thus Isabella and Ferdinand turned their eyes toward Granada. Chapter 2. The War of Granada. The war was not short. It lasted a full decade, from 1482 until 1492, unfolding through sieges, raids, and campaigns that dragged men and supplies across mountains and valleys. Granada itself was a kingdom of striking beauty. Whitewashed towns perched on hillsides, orchards of pomegranates and olives, and fortresses with walls of stone gleaming in the Andalusian sun. But behind its beauty lay tension, for the emirate was divided, weakened by faction, even as Castile and Aragon pressed harder at its borders. The Castilian army was not always efficient. Its soldiers were often peasants pressed into service, marching for months at a time with little pay and poor supplies. Horses grew thin, armor rusted, food was scarce. Campaigns dragged on, interrupted by weather and delay. And yet, slowly, steadily, Granada's lands shrank under the pressure. Isabella was not a queen who ruled from afar. She was present with her armies, establishing camps, directing supplies, and even riding out to see fortresses with her own eyes. Chroniclers record her visits, her insistence on being near the front, her willingness to sleep in tents when necessary. This presence gave her troops confidence. It also gave rise to stories, some true, some exaggerated, and some, like the vow of underclothes, likely imagined. Chapter 3. The Vow of Linen. According to the legend, during one of these campaigns, Isabella made a peculiar vow. She swore that she would not change her linen undergarments until the war was won, until Granada had fallen and Spain was united under her crown. The image is a powerful one, a queen in her camp, clothed in the same linen week after week, month after month, as battles raged and sieges tightened. For her soldiers, the story symbolized endurance. She would not enjoy comfort until victory was secured. She tied her own body, her own habits, to the fate of her army. But as time passed, the tale grew stranger. Later storytellers claimed that she kept this vow for years, so long that her personal neglect spread disease, threatening plague across Spain. It became a mocking story, told not to honor her, but to illustrate the backwardness of an age when even queens were thought to live in filth. Was the story true? Almost certainly not. There is no contemporary record of Isabella making such a vow. Chroniclers of her reign, who described her in great detail, mention nothing of it. It appears only later, as an anecdote, retold more for its shock value than for its accuracy. But myths often endure more stubbornly than facts, and this one clung to Isabella's name. Chapter 4. Cleanliness and Hygiene in the Middle Ages. To understand how such a story could take root, one must consider what cleanliness meant in the 15th century. For us today, to remain unwashed for months is almost unthinkable. We are accustomed to daily showers, clean clothes, soap, and hot water at our command. In Isabella's day, things were different. Baths existed, but they were rare and sometimes even mistrusted. Physicians warned that hot water could open the pores and let in disease. Public bathhouses, once common in Europe, had declined, associated with immorality, or closed entirely during outbreaks of plague. Instead, people relied on linen. Fine white undergarments, worn close to the skin, were changed regularly, or at least as regularly as was possible. Nobles like Isabella would have had wardrobes of such garments, washed by servants, pressed and scented with herbs. Perfumes and powders also helped. Lavender, rosewater, or crushed herbs masked unpleasant odors. Cleanliness, in short, was not about soap and water, but about linen, scent, and careful appearance. Thus, when a legend claimed that Isabella did not change her linen, it suggested not only discomfort, but also neglect of the very standard by which people judged cleanliness in her age. Chapter 5. The Making of a Myth. How then did the tale survive? Why did people repeat it? Legends grow easily when they are unusual, when they contain a detail that makes listeners pause. The idea of a queen, ruler of the richest kingdom in Iberia, vowing not to change her underclothes, that was memorable. It was strange enough to spread. Perhaps it began as a soldier's joke. Perhaps it was an enemy's slander. Perhaps it was a misunderstanding of her symbolic vows of austerity. But once spoken, it took on a life of its own. For centuries afterward, Isabella was remembered not only as the queen who united Spain, not only as the queen who financed Columbus, but also as the queen's vow of clothing nearly brought her people to plague.
Chapter 6. The True Isabella. Yet, when we step back from the myth, the real Isabella emerges. She was a woman of determination, intellect, and strength. She reformed her court, rooting out corruption. She established a professional army, one of the first in Europe. She centralized royal power, diminishing the influence of unruly nobles. She guided her children into marriages that tied Spain to England, to the Holy Roman Empire, to Portugal. And in 1492, she and Ferdinand financed Christopher Columbus, sending ships westward on a voyage that would alter the course of history. This Isabella was not the stuff of laundry room gossip. She was one of the most powerful rulers of her age. And yet, the strange little myth of her vow of linen clings to her still.
To the Holy Roman Empire, to Portugal. And in 1492, she and Ferdinand financed Christopher Columbus, sending ships westward on a voyage that would alter the course of history. This Isabella was not the stuff of laundry room gossip. She was one of the most powerful rulers of her age. And yet the strange little myth of her vow of linen clings to her still, a curious echo of how people choose to remember. Chapter 7. Legends and Memory. What then does this story teach us? Perhaps that history is not only made of battles and treaties, but of stories that capture the imagination. Sometimes what endures is not the truth, but the tale. Isabella the Catholic united Spain, brought down Granada, and launched voyages across the seas. Yet ask many today, and some will recall only the rumor of her vow not to change her underclothes. Legends are powerful. They reduce complexity into something simple. They bring rulers down to human scale. They surprise, they amuse, they linger. And once they linger long enough, they blur into memory, becoming part of the past, even if they never happened at all. Chapter 8. Daily Life in Isabella's Spain. Beyond the palaces and battlefields, life in Isabella's Castile was steady and ordinary. The towns of Castile were crowded with narrow streets, markets filled with the smell of fish and meat, merchants calling out their wares, and donkeys carrying baskets of grain and olives. In the countryside, peasants rose with the sun, tending sheep on the great plains or plowing the fields with wooden plows pulled by oxen. For most people, life was harsh but predictable. Houses were small, often just a single room, with floors of packed earth and walls of wood and mud. Families cooked simple meals of bread, onions, beans, and sometimes pork or fish when it could be afforded. Water was drawn from wells, and light came from tallow candles that smoked and sputtered in the evening air. To these people, their queen was both distant and near. Distant in her grandeur, her court, her processions, but near in the sense that her wars, her taxes, and her decrees touched their daily lives. The legend of her vow would have carried into these villages like a rumor from far away, half believed, half dismissed, but repeated around firesides all the same. Chapter 9. The Siege Camp. Imagine now the siege camp of the Castilian army before Granada. Tents stretched across the plain, canvas flapping in the wind. Smoke from cook fires rose into the air, mingling with the dust of thousands of men and animals. Horses whinnied, dogs barked. The clang of hammers echoed as smiths repaired armor and weapons. At night, the camp was alive with sound. Soldiers sang, argued, or told stories to pass the long hours. Fires burned low, and shadows moved across the canvas walls. Supplies arrived slowly, carts of flour and barrels of wine pulled across rough roads. When food was scarce, men ate stale bread and whatever meat could be hunted nearby. Disease spread quickly. Dysentery, fevers,
coughs, and doctors with little knowledge tried to keep men alive with herbs and prayers. Into this camp came Isabella. Chroniclers record her visits, her firm discipline, her insistence on order. She was no idle queen in a palace. She sat among her generals, signed orders, and oversaw the gathering of supplies. Her presence was a symbol, a reassurance, and in the weary gossip of soldiers, it is easy to see how a story like her vow could take shape. An image of their queen, enduring discomfort as they did, sharing in their suffering. Chapter 10. Linen and Symbolism. To us, the vow seems strange. Why linen? Why underclothes? But in Isabella's age, linen carried meaning. It was the mark of cleanliness, of dignity, of refinement. For nobles, to change linen was not just about comfort, but about honor and appearance. By refusing to change her linen, Isabella was, according to the story, sacrificing that comfort and dignity, binding herself to the same hardships as her soldiers. It became a symbolic gesture, whether real or invented, that told listeners she was no different from the men in her camps. For a queen, such symbolism mattered, and for later storytellers, it became easy to exaggerate, to twist, until the vow became a legend of filth and disease. Chapter 11. Rumor, Satire, and Memory. It is worth remembering that stories in the 15th and 16th centuries traveled slowly but stubbornly. They were repeated in taverns, in markets, in churchyards after sermons. They appeared in letters, in chronicles, in half-forgotten remarks written on the margins of manuscripts. Some stories were told to praise, others were told to mock. Isabella's vow may have begun as praise, an image of endurance, but later, in the hands of rivals or critics, it became satire, a way of mocking the queen by suggesting that she was unclean and that her neglect spread sickness. Over centuries, satire hardened into myth, and the myth became what people remembered, long after the truth was lost in dusty records. Chapter 12. Hygiene across Europe. The story of Isabella is not unique. Across Europe, rulers were remembered for their habits of cleanliness or their lack of it. Louis XIV of France was said to bathe rarely. Queen Elizabeth I of England was rumored to wash only once a month. Even great emperors and popes were accused of neglecting their hygiene. These stories often said less about the reality of their lives and more about the fascination people had with the private habits of the powerful. Cleanliness is intimate. To speak of it is to bring rulers down from their thrones, to imagine them not as distant figures of authority, but as ordinary people with bodies and habits, with smells and stains, with flaws that could be exaggerated for effect. Isabella's vow fit neatly into this tradition, making her seem both remarkable and strangely human. Chapter 13. The Fall of Granada. And so, after 10 long years of war, Granada finally fell in 1492. The great Alhambra Palace, with its red stone walls and delicate arches, passed into the hands of Isabella and Ferdinand. Bells rang in Castile, processions marched in Aragon. The Reconquista was complete. According to the myth, Isabella at last changed her garments, her vow fulfilled. According to history, she and Ferdinand entered Granada in triumph, receiving the surrender of its rulers. Either way, the story of the vow was tied forever to the fall of the last Muslim kingdom in Spain. Chapter 14. The Persistence of the Tale. Centuries later, historians and storytellers still repeated the anecdote. Some believed it, some mocked it. Some used it as a curious detail to add color to their accounts of Spain's past. Even now, in our time, it appears in books and conversations, repeated as though it were fact, though historians insist it is not. And so we are left with two Isabellas. One, the true queen, who reformed her kingdom, unified Spain, and launched voyages that changed the world. The other, the mythical queen, who made a vow of linen and nearly brought plague upon her people. Chapter 15. Daily Life in Castile. To understand the legend of Isabella, we must step into the lives of the people who lived under her rule. Imagine a Castilian town in the late 15th century. Narrow streets paved with cobblestones, their surfaces worn smooth by carts and the hooves of mules. Houses leaned inward over the alleys, their upper floors supported by wooden beams that seemed to creak as the wind passed through. The marketplace was the center of every town. At dawn, the first cries of merchants could be heard. Fishermen carrying baskets of sardines from the coast, farmers with carts of onions, garlic, and beans, women selling cheese wrapped in cloth. The air was heavy with scents, salt fish, strong wine, roasting meat, the sweetness of figs in summer. People bargained slowly, repeating their offers, their voices steady and patient, for markets were not hurried affairs, but the steady rhythm of daily exchange. Religion shaped life deeply. Bells rang from the churches at dawn, at noon, at dusk, calling people to prayer. In small villages, the parish priest was often the only figure who could read and write, his authority extending into every corner of life. Festivals marked the calendar. Easter processions, where men carried statues of Christ through the streets. Corpus Christi celebration
with carpets of flowers, and saints' days that brought music, dancing, and brief pauses from labor. For most, the diet was plain. Bread was the staple, dark and heavy, baked in communal ovens. To this was added beans, lentils, onions, and whatever meat could be afforded. Pork for those who could raise pigs, mutton when a sheep was slaughtered, salted fish on days of fasting. Wine was common, watered down and drunk by all, even children. Sweetness was rare, a luxury saved for feast days. This was the Spain Isabella ruled, a world of narrow streets, crowded markets, flickering candles, and ordinary routines. A world in which a rumor about a queen's vow could seem both believable and memorable, something to be repeated again and again. Chapter 16. The Queen's Court. While peasants lived in small homes of wood and earth, Isabella's life was framed by palaces and courts. Yet even here, the world was not so splendid as we might imagine today. The royal court traveled often, moving from one town to another, setting up temporary centers of power. Wherever Isabella stayed, her household followed. Servants, scribes, cooks, guards, priests, and ladies-in-waiting. The court was not a single palace, but a moving community, sometimes numbering hundreds. Its presence transformed the towns where it stopped, filling markets, crowding inns, and exhausting supplies. Ceremony defined every moment. Audiences were formal affairs. Subjects approached the queen slowly, bowing deeply, speaking with rehearsed words. Clothes mattered. Nobles wore velvet and silk when they could obtain it, adorned with jewelry of silver and gold. Isabella herself dressed with dignity rather than extravagance. Chroniclers described her garments as fine but modest, her hair often covered, her bearing serious. She was not known for frivolity. Meals at court were lengthy. Long tables were set with trenchers of bread, meats roasted whole, pies filled with spiced fish, bowls of stewed vegetables. Servants carried in wines, poured into silver goblets. Yet even here, amid such feasting, the standards of hygiene were not what we know today. Hands were rinsed in basins before and after meals, but utensils were few.
People ate with knives, with fingers, with bread itself as a tool. In this environment, the legend of Isabella's vow carried a curious irony. For all the dignity of court, all the pageantry and power, people chose to remember their queen not for her ceremonies, but for a rumor of garments, a detail of personal life that cut through grandeur and reduced her to the level of common gossip. Chapter 17, The War of Granada Revisited. Let us return again to the war, for it was here that the story was born. Granada lay at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, its city crowned by the Alhambra, a palace of delicate arches and courtyards, its red walls gleaming against the hills. The campaign against it was long and exhausting. Roads were poor, supplies were slow, and armies moved with difficulty. Castilian soldiers carried spears, crossbows, and arquebuses, early firearms that filled the air with smoke and thunder. They wore quilted jackets or simple breastplates, heavy to march in beneath the Andalusian sun. Generals rode horses, their banners fluttering, calling their men forward. Siege engines, tall wooden towers, catapults, and cannons were dragged across the plains to batter the walls of Granada's fortresses. The war tested not only armies, but also patience. Seasons passed with little progress. Rain turned camps to mud. Summer heat dried rivers and scorched fields. Soldiers fell ill more often than they fell in battle. And all the while, Isabella remained. She moved between camps, met with commanders, and ensured that supplies continued to flow. Chroniclers praised her for this steadfast presence, a queen who shared in the endurance of her people. And here, again, we see how the legend might have been imagined, that if she endured the same hardships as her soldiers, she too must have delayed the comforts of clean garments, a symbolic vow that tied her body to the fate of the war. Chapter 18, How Legends Spread. Legends do not remain in one place. They travel, they change as they move. The story of Isabella's vow was told in Spain, but it did not remain there. It was repeated in Italy, in France, in Germany, in England. Each retelling added its own flavor, its own exaggeration. What began as a story of endurance became in the mouths of others a tale of filth. In some versions, Isabella was mocked as a queen who reeked of neglect. In others, she was pitied, a woman so bound by duty that she sacrificed her dignity. Europe in the 16th century was a world of pamphlets and chronicles, of letters passed between courts, of merchants who carried stories along with their goods. Rumor was as valuable as spice or silk, traded freely across borders. And the stranger a story, the more quickly it spread. By the time centuries had passed, the vow of linen was no longer questioned. It appeared in books as though it were fact. Teachers repeated it. Historians recorded it without pause. Only later did scholars look closely, realizing that no true evidence existed. By then, the myth was already deeply rooted. Chapter 19, The Nature of Memory. What does this teach us? That memory is not a mirror of the past, but a tapestry woven from threads of truth and threads of imagination. People remember what is vivid, what is strange, what makes them laugh or shudder. They forget what is steady, ordinary, or complex. Isabella's true achievements were many. She unified Spain, reformed its administration, strengthened its armies, and projected its power across oceans. But those deeds, though great, are complicated. They require explanation. They demand context. By contrast, the story of her vow is simple. It requires no explanation, only a single startling image, a queen who would not change her clothes. And so the legend remains, while the reality is often forgotten. Conclusion, drifting deeper. As you lie now, perhaps with eyes closed, listening to these words in the steady cadence of history, let the legend rest beside the truth. Isabella of Castile was a queen of immense power, whose decisions shaped the fate of Spain and the wider world. Yet she is also remembered for a vow she likely never made, for a story born of rumor and carried by time. This is the nature of history. It is not only what happened, but what is remembered. Not only records in archives, but whispers that pass from one generation to the next. And sometimes, as tonight, those whispers become a gentle story, told slowly, calmly, until they lull the listener into quiet rest.